Parshas, this week's Parsha is Parshas Pekudei. It's called Shabbos Chazak. Shabbos Chazak literally means the Shabbos of strength. Why is it the Shabbos of strength? It's the Shabbos of strength because we finished this week one of the books of the Torah, the second book. The first book is the book of Bereshis, the book of Genesis. Now we're finishing the book of Exodus, the book of Shemos, which began with the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, all the way until where we're holding now, which we'll get to in a few minutes. So at the end of the reading, everyone announces together, Chazak, Chazak, v'nis chazek, which means, let us be strong, let us be strong, let us strengthen each other, meaning we should strengthen each other with the study of the Torah. The fact that we're finishing a book should motivate us and inspire us, not just to be inspired, as we mentioned last week, but to continue learning and to enhance our learning and increase our learning. That's this week's Parsha, special week. Pekudei means reckoning. It actually means numbers. Pekudei. That's the name of this week's Parsha. Because the primary theme of this week's Parsha is a reckoning, an audit. An audit of all the materials that were brought as contributions for the building of the Mishkan, which that is the theme that we have been learning for the past 4 weeks plus. We've been learning about the mitzvah for Bnei Yisrael, for the Jewish people, to give gold, silver, copper, and other materials for the purpose of building the Mishkan, building the tabernacle, building the sanctuary, the temple, which became the Mishkan in the desert. And after all those weeks, now Moshe makes an audit. And that's this week's Parsha. But just to fit it into a little bit of a timeline, so we could appreciate what's happening here, it goes like this. Last week I mentioned that it was the day after Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the second pair of tablets, the second luchos, and everyone saw that they had been forgiven for the golden calf. Moshe Rabbeinu gathers all of Bnei Yisrael, this is last week, men, women, and children, and he tells them about this mitzvah of contributing gold and silver and all the other materials, plenty of also wood, wool, for the purpose of constructing this Mishkan. As I mentioned last week, within only 2 days, they brought all the materials. And not only did they bring all the materials, they brought more than enough, to the extent that Moshe had to send the messenger to say, stop bringing. So if you're with me, we're holding just 3 days, a short number of days after Yom Kippur. Last week we also were told that it was Bezalel, a young boy. It was actually Moshe's great-great-nephew, together with another person by the name of Eliyav, which was from a different family. They were in charge of overseeing the operation of taking these materials and making the Mishkan out of them, meaning, melting the gold and the silver and welding and forming and everything, carving and so on. These two people were in charge of this whole operation. There were many talented people that contributed of their talents.
Where did they get all that material in the Midbar?
Because when they left the Mitzrayim, when they left Egypt, they left with lots of wealth.
But all the zinc and copper and iron and nails and all that.
So, Frida, a few weeks ago I mentioned that sometimes there are those materials, you're right, that they did not take with them, and they had to get them from neighboring countries or from other lands. And even that was in such a short period of time, which is amazing.
Amazing, right?
Wait, yeah.
Well, there were nisim, there were a lot of nisim.
You're saying nisim, miracles, but it's funny you use that word because the Medrash, I don't want to get carried away with this because it's last week's Parsha, but the Medrash sees the word hanisiim, which literally means the priest, but the way it's spelled different, and they understand that to mean the clouds, that the clouds brought certain materials. Okay, that's a medrash on last week's Parsha, but let's stay focused on this week. So now they brought all these materials, and they know who's in charge, and they're starting to do the work. The project of the building and forming the Mishkan was also pretty quick. So if you're following with me on the Jewish calendar, it's a few days after Yom Kippur. They had it done on the 25th day of Kislev, which is under 2.5 months later. Less than 2.5 months later, everything was done and ready to go. And now that they have everything ready to go, they bring it to Moshe. They bring it to Moses. To now, we donated the materials, we contributed the materials, we did whatever we could. We also formed it into the vessels the way Hashem wanted it to be, the way God instructed Moshe to make them. And now we're ready for you to make it into a dwelling place for Hashem. But that didn't happen. For the next 3 months, a little bit less than 3 months, just a little bit less, the Mishkan stood or sat idle. No, nothing. What does it mean idle? It was not yet used to be as a sanctuary. All the vessels were ready, the walls were ready. Hashem was waiting for a special date. And finally, here's mentioned this week's parsha. Finally, on the 23rd day of Adar, Adar is the month that we are in now. Okay? So on the 23rd day of Adar, Moshe was told to start erecting the Mishkan, because in over a week's time, in 8 days, the service in the Mishkan would begin. So for the next week, that whole week, starting from the 23rd of Adar, 24th, 25th, 26th, all the way until the 30th of Adar, until the first day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which would start the first anniversary ever since they left Mitzrayim, they left Egypt, because that was also in that month of Nisan. So for that week, Moshe was the one doing the service. And in fact, our sages tell us something very interesting, learned from this week's parsha, that all those days Moshe would construct it, he would erect the Mishkan, but it was weak, it was not able to stand. He would take it apart at night, put it together in the morning, do the service himself, no one else, and take it apart. Until on the 8th day, which is the first day of Nisan, that's when the service actually started, with the Kohen Gadol, with Aaron, the high priest, and all the other Kohanim, his children, doing the service.
Why was he taking it apart?
Exactly.
Unless they were moving.
It was not yet an enduring sanctuary for Hashem. It was not yet permanent. Or when I say actually permanent, it might not be the right word. It was not yet a stable sanctuary for Hashem. Only on the 8th day is when it became an enduring sanctuary for Hashem.
There wasn't any.
What changed was, Kabbalistically speaking, what changed was the number 8. There's something about the number 8, beyond 7. 7 represents nature, and 8 represents beyond nature. And in addition to that, what also changed was that the month changed. Going from the month of Adar to the month of Nisan, Nisan means nes, miracle. And this whole idea of having Hashem's presence, God's presence amongst human beings is a miracle, is a nes. So that's the answer to the question in short. Obviously, it's something that we're going to be speaking about much more in coming weeks when we speak about the 8th day. In fact, there's a parsha called Shmini, which is the 8th, referring to the 8th day that we are talking about now. So we're going to have a lot to speak about that. But this week's parsha speaks about up until the 8th day, those 7 days. And the finale of this week's parsha, which is also the finale of the entire book of Shmos, after which we all announce Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek, we motivate each other to continue learning, is as follows. That the Torah tells us how Hashem's presence would be in the Mishkan. In other words, there would be a cloud representing Hashem's presence in the Mishkan. When the cloud would leave, they knew that it's time to unpack, to take apart the Mishkan and to start traveling. And that's the way it was. For the next 40 years, that was the system. In other words, there were some places that they stayed for many, many years. But whenever the cloud would leave the Mishkan, they knew it's time to unpack it and get going. And that is the very end of this week's parsha, the very end of the book. Yes?
When did the second Adar start? Like this year? This year we have 2 Adars, right?
So when did that concept start?
Yeah.
I mean,
2 Adars.
I think a few weeks ago I spoke about how that worked, because the Jewish, but it's not that it's complicated, but it's comprehensive. It includes a lot of details. Okay, so I'll be happy to explain it soon.
Okay, cool.
Well, it depends when they started having leap years.
No, because the Jewish calendar needs a leap year in order to adjust to get to seasons. Because if you just follow the moon, then you're going to end up having Pesach sometimes in the winter, Pesach sometimes in the fall. But you want to get, Pesach has to stay in the springtime.
So in other words, leap year isn't necessary every exact number of months.
We have it in an exact science because it automatically, if we follow that science, we're adjusting the years. That Pesach never falls out in the winter because it's not supposed to. The Torah says you're supposed to celebrate Pesach in the springtime. Chag Aviv, exactly. Chodesh Aviv, the whole Nisan is supposed to be in the month of spring. So we add another. So simply put, it's not what I'm about to say is not the perfect template of it, but every few years we fall back. That's the way it is. The Jewish year, the lunar year following the moon is 11 days shorter than the solar year. So we fall back, and then we jump ahead with adding another month. We fall back, and jump ahead.
So it's not like every 4 years,
It is. We have a system, but the mitzvah in the Torah is not that way. It's that whenever you see the need to adjust, add a month.
It's different. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that is, in short, the overview of this week's parsha. As I mentioned, it's the audit, the beginning of the service before it became the 8th day, when it became enduring and lasting, and the very end of the parsha is about the cloud lifting, and then they would continue to travel. The majority of tonight's class will be what we're starting right now, which is a halacha, a fascinating halacha actually, that we learned from this week's parsha. It's interesting that we don't actually find many places where it says we know this halacha from this week's parsha. Nevertheless, this week's parsha is the greatest illustration of this idea. What is it? In Hebrew it's called Maras Ayin. Maras Ayin literally means, no, that's Ayin Hara. Maras Ayin means, what?
The way it looks.
The way it looks, the appearance of the eye. Appearance to the eye. In other words, what it means is like this, very simply put. There are a lot of things in life that are 100% permissible. There's nothing wrong with doing it. The only issue with doing it would be when someone else sees you, what they'll think. Now, you might want to ask, who cares what they think? But there are, no, and that's true. It's important to say that because how much are we supposed to care what people think what we're doing? You know, if we're doing the right thing and we're doing the right thing. But there's two factors here. In addition to the fact that we don't want people to suspect that we're doing the wrong thing, we also don't want other people to see it and learn from it that they're allowed to do something, and in other words, they're going to end up doing the wrong thing. Let me use an example. What I'm about to use is an example that's very basic for this idea. Let's say someone goes to Israel, and he sees, oh wow, in Israel, they sell kosher cheeseburgers. So it must be that cheeseburgers are kosher. They didn't realize either the burger was a vegetable burger or the cheese wasn't real cheese. One of the two, right? So that would be a classical case of Maras Ayin. Someone sees something and thinks that what you're doing is wrong, or they think it must not, I always heard that cheeseburgers are not kosher. Oh, it's such baloney. I was in Israel and I myself saw that they ate cheeseburgers. In the middle of the street, I saw it said kosher and they ate cheeseburgers. This example that I just used obviously could be used in many different things, right? You go to a kosher wedding, and at the end of the wedding, it was a great meal, and they had meat, and they had soup and everything, and then they serve coffee, and you see, or ice cream, very good, ice cream, or milk.
Right, and creamers.
Creamers, exactly. So here we're getting into interesting territory because a lot of things when it comes to this topic that we're speaking about tonight does change with time. Meaning, if it becomes common practice that people know that, ice cream is not necessarily dairy. If you see a white substance next to the milk, next to the coffee, it doesn't mean that it's milk, right? I mean, I don't know, so correct me if I'm wrong. 30 years ago, it was more likely that it was milk. But nowadays, it's much more common to have almond milk, to have soy milk, to have other things like that. So you see, with time, sort of the suspicion changes too, because the perception is a different perception when seeing it. But this is going to be the topic we're going to be speaking about. It applies in many different areas of Torah law. There are many things, for example, I'll use another example. And I'm worried about getting into too many examples before we get to the learning, but just to show how it covers a lot of different topics and bases. The Gemara brings a case, and it's actually quoted in halacha, meaning this is the way it is in Jewish law, that if there's a ruin, basically a home that's abandoned, and no one goes there, so then a person shouldn't go inside. Even if they need the bathroom and it's a good place to go, or they just want to go there to daven. Let's say they're traveling and they see an empty house, a shell. They shouldn't go inside. Why? What's the connection? Someone will see and say, this guy's up to shady things. Probably going to meet someone there, probably not the best of places. Probably this person's not doing something not kosher. Right. So that's another classical example of the guy's doing nothing wrong. They're just looking for a quiet place to daven, to pray. Right? But since others will see that that's what you're doing, and they'll interpret it to say, oh, you think this guy is so kosher, you know what this guy's up to, then that's going to lead to misinterpretation. This is the topic I want to focus on today, because ultimately, not only is this something that we learn from this week's parsha, it is this week's parsha. The name of the parsha, Pekudei, is that Moshe did an audit. Moshe did an audit. That means he knew that he has to be beyond reproach as well, that he should stick away from suspicion. Let's read inside in the halacha. This is from the Bach, not to be confused with the music Bach. This is Bach as in, the Bayis Chadash that we have here on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Torah. So he says like this: although we do not question the accurateness of the reputable distributors of charity funds, in other words, if someone is a reputable person who's in charge of a charity fund, we don't suspect that they're doing something wrong. Nevertheless, it is correct, halachically correct, for them to give an accounting. So organizations, despite the fact that we're not suspecting them, but nevertheless they should go out of their way to let people know how they're distributing the funds, how they're using the money. As we find with Moshe, our teacher, that he gave an accounting from the contributions of the Mishkan. In this week's parsha, as it says, and these are the numbers of the Mishkan. This is the name of this week's parsha, the reckoning. Since no one is clean from reproach, even the greats like Moshe, that the Creator attested to his trustworthiness, nevertheless, he gave an exact reckoning. Moshe knew that even though he's Moshe and everyone trusts him and everyone looks up to him, nevertheless, number one, he has to set an example for everyone else how to do it. But even he wanted to be clean, absolutely clean. In fact, this idea is actually something written in the Torah. It's not just that we learn it from Moshe. We actually learn it from a different place in the Torah. I don't want to get into the exact context, but I'll reference it a little bit. It's when the descendants of Gad and Reuven, this comes in many years later, they didn't want to go into the land of Israel after, when they would conquer the land. They said Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan River, was a much more appropriate place for them and their cattle. So Moshe made them make a promise that they would go into the land, fight for the land, and then afterwards they would return. And he says like this. This is the exact expression that Moshe uses, and let's see this inside. It's number 2, guiltless. And the land will be conquered before Hashem. Afterwards you may return, and you shall be guiltless towards Hashem and Israel. In other words, he says it's not only important for you to be guilt-free in the eyes of Hashem, in other words, that God sees, you didn't do anything wrong, but it's also important, and ironically, it's equally as important for a person to be free of guilt from their fellow human being. That other people shouldn't see them and say, oh, this person is doing something wrong. You could say, oh, Hashem knows that I did what's right. Yeah, but you have to make sure that other people would also not look at what you're saying and think you're doing something wrong. In fact, I came across this incredible quote for the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer was one of the great Torah giants and rabbis about 200 years ago in Poland. And I think I'm getting the years right, and he writes like this. I'm going to say the words in Hebrew are very powerful. The translation in English doesn't get it as much, so I'll just read the beginning of the Hebrew. It says, Kol yamai hayisi mitztar al mikra hazeh. I have been pained my entire life by this verse. Which verse? That you shall be guiltless towards Hashem and Israel. He says these two obligations, A, to be guiltless, I'm on page 4, towards Hashem, and B, to be guiltless in the eyes of the Jewish people, are two corresponding requirements which lie upon us. Basically, I don't know if corresponding is the right words, but they're two like pair of requirements that hang upon us. And he says like this. This is the quote that I was referring to. It is a lot more feasible, in other words, like easier to fulfill the first requirement, namely to be found virtuous in the eyes of Hashem, than to be found virtuous in the eyes of the creations, a fellow human being. Why? Because fellow human beings have idle thoughts. In other words, they're constantly suspicious about what we're doing, whereas in the eyes of Hashem, obviously, Hashem knows the truth. He says, and not only that, we have to realize that this whole mitzvah of making sure we shouldn't be interpreted that we're doing the wrong thing, it's about Chil Hashem. Chil Hashem meaning it's a desecration for Hashem's name when someone sees us doing something and they think we're doing something wrong. For example, I'll use the example that we had before in halacha, that if someone says, oh, that organization, they just take money and who knows what they do with it. The fact that it's not well known what the organization does with the money, it's not public and it's not clear, it's not transparent like they say, that leads to Chil Hashem. It leads to people saying, oh, you know, these organizations, they're using it for who knows what.
A bunch of phonies.
Right. So that's a very terrible Chil Hashem. And what does it lead people to do? They're suspicious. They don't want to give tzedakah because they don't know. They're not confident that it's going to be used properly. The terrible snowball of effects that comes out of that. So that's just using this example. You could use it in other examples too about the cheeseburger too. And again, I'm not taking the responsibility now to say that therefore the cheeseburgers that are sold in Israel, which are vegetarian, are not okay. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the reason why it's an issue and it has to be addressed and a rabbi has to come and say it is okay and it's not so simple is because we're concerned about the snowball effect that will be when other people see what they think and how they translate it. Okay, so before we go into specific cases, I want to be clear about this whole topic, and we're about to do a definition of this mitzvah or this prohibition of Maras Ayin. And the following quote comes from Moshe Feinstein, who I mentioned him several times. We have his sefer right here. Actually, the quote that I have here does come from a book that, just one second, I'm sorry. Yes. So, Moshe Feinstein passed away in 1987, and he, you know, they used to say, have an expression. They used to say that Orthodox rabbis only need to know one thing. This is in the 80s, they used to say that. All they have to know is Moshe Feinstein's number. Because here we're talking about one out of, you know, many, many books of all his responses and answers. A lot of contemporary issues that we know the halachic approach to it is from Moshe Feinstein. He lived in New York, and he was a Paisek, a halachic authority of his time, an incredible individual.
Who was his musbah?
Who gave him smicha?
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
No, not you. Moshe Feinstein.
I know who gave him smicha. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, but so when speaking about this topic, the first thing he has an incredible letter. So I'll tell you the whole letter soon, because it was basically a story, which we'll see soon, that someone was writing to him and saying, I saw you do something which I think people are going to say is wrong. Can you imagine? Writing to him and saying, Moshe Feinstein, I saw you do something that if it's right or wrong, I don't know, but there are people in the streets that are going to say things about you. I'll get to you. I'll get to you what it is. I'll tell you what it is soon. But right now, I'll just tell you, in that context, it's not a long letter, but in that context, he defines this mitzvah. Or again, I'm using the word mitzvah, I mean this halacha, this law. He says like this. Let's read the English. He says, if someone thinks that I violated something, or he thinks that I inappropriately ate something non-kosher, that is the definition of Maras Ayin. However, it does not include doing something permitted that people may mistakenly think is forbidden due to the fact that they do not know the Jewish law. Let me explain what that means. If you're doing something absolutely okay, there's nothing wrong with it at all, there's no room, that's not Maras Ayin. We're not concerned about what are people going to say. We are concerned about what people are going to say in the following case, and let me explain. Drinking milk eating meat at the same time is a problem. You are the one who's doing it in the permitted way by using almond milk. But everyone who sees it sees the standard default way, which is milk and meat being consumed together. Okay? So you see the difference? He's saying, if you're doing something absolutely permitted, then you don't have to worry about what people are going to say. The halacha that we're describing here and all the cases that we're going to be learning about here are if other people do it the wrong way, other people do it in the prohibited way, for example, milk and meat, and you're worried. You're doing it the right way, but you're worried that other people are going to see you and think you're doing it the standard way. That is marasan. Is that clear? It's a fine line here, but do you get how that works? In other words, in both cases, you're obviously absolutely in the green. In other words, you're okay. But in one case, you're the one who's doing it differently than everyone else. Everyone else, when drinking milk and meat, it's actually milk and it's actual meat. In a regular McDonald's, that's what it is. It's actual milk, actual meat. So what you did is you took McDonald's and did a kosher McDonald's by changing it. That's a problem. That's a problem because you're going to be labeled just like all the other McDonald's are labeled. However, the case that he was describing about himself then and saying how it does not fall under that category was when you're doing something that's absolutely okay.
So what did somebody see him do?
So should I jump to it? I'll tell you since you asked. I'm tempted now to just keep you in suspense. Yeshard, I'm actually tempted now to say, a few minutes, wait. But,
I'll wait.
Okay, so you know what, then we'll wait.
But if you do it in your house and nobody sees,
Oh.
that's what you got to be.
You make a good point, but even in the Gemara itself, where it's first introduced this idea, it says, anything that was made forbidden, prohibited, because what people would say, it's forbidden and prohibited even in the comfort of your own home, even in the secrecy of your own home. Because we don't make that difference.
Right.
We don't say, like I'll give you an example. We don't say, let's say I have a business meeting and someone says, okay, let's meet in McDonald's. So I said, what's the big deal? All I'm going to do is maybe I'll drink water. No, what? Wait, so let's say you say, yeah, but I'm in Idaho. No Jews are going to see me anyways. Or you say, I don't know, some place where there isn't a Jewish community. You might say, what do I have to worry about here? No one's going to see and no one's going to suspect. If you're not allowed, you're not allowed anywhere, even in your own home. And I use that example to make the comparison. Just like the McDonald's in Idaho is like my own home.
Why not in your own home?
Because once it was forbidden, it became forbidden there too.
Because once you start, you never could tell somebody you walk in, you never could tell, something could happen. And it'll be
Someone
Marasan.
can look through the window or.
That's right, that's right.
You may
But it's interesting you say that. Peeping. One of the halachas.
Somebody walks by,
Your point is correct. Your point is absolutely correct. The point you're making is correct. However, I was trying to find interesting cases or interesting expressions of this law.
Didn't you have a story about a rabbi last year or the year before that somebody saw him in a restaurant or something? I remember something.
Yeah, you're right. You're actually right. That
What's that?
if we were speaking about the same thing, it happened with me. And the story goes like this: that I actually approached a rabbi at one time, asking him if I could meet people in Dunkin' Donuts. So at first he said, what's the problem? Well, Dunkin' Donuts, you take a coffee, and a lot of times even the food is kosher. So what's the issue? I said, no, it's a particular issue because I noticed, at least in this Dunkin' Donuts where I met someone, that they sort of rebranded because all their signs outside are advertising hot dogs and advertising sausages. So it became a new type of store. He said, if that's the case, then you're right. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't meet anyone there. If there are signs outside, if you could go in to buy a coffee and leave, you could do that. But if you're sitting down with someone, and this is usually a place where people sit down to eat, and this is the way it's being advertised or portrayed as a sausage place, then it's not a place to sit.
It's interesting, because the one on Jow just went kosher a while ago.
Right.
And I think they have vegetarian sausage that's kosher, everything's kosher in the store.
Interesting.
And I just noticed that.
I didn't. Do they have sausages there?
I'm pretty sure they have, yeah.
Veggie sauce.
Probably
Veggie sausage,
veggie
yeah.
sausage.
But sometimes they announce like, oh, sausage sandwich. They don't even say it sounds weird.
Right. Okay, but that's a story. You know, the thing is, Starbucks is still seen. Now, I don't want to get into the halachic issues with Starbucks. It's another issue. But assuming that it's all okay to drink coffee, so then it's still known as a coffee establishment. Someone who sees you sitting there doesn't think beyond coffee. Maybe they may sell a few things, but they're still known to be a place to meet and drink coffee. See, it's all about perception. It's all about how it's being seen.
But there's coffee and there's coffee. I mean, black coffee is one thing, but everything they put in it, that's not kosher.
Yeah, but I mean, when someone buys a coffee from Starbucks, it's very likely that, I mean, the coffee itself usually has no issue.
That's all.
And the milk, unless you.
Right, the Chalav Yisrael, right? There are a lot of cases for this. I'm trying to think of other situations like that.
They put soya milk in as well.
But the few examples that I brought here are going to be really what becomes like the guiding light in this topic, because these are the sources from the Gemara itself. Yes, Sophie.
I have a question. In one of the books that I study in the morning, they had a parable. And the lesson in the parable is to judge everyone fairly and honestly and goodly. So the story is about, you probably know the story, I can't remember the name.
Now, Sophie, can I take 1 second and say like this before you get to the story? I do want to make that clear now before I go further in learning this topic, and that is, I'm not talking about when we see someone do something, our train of thought must be to see the positive and not right away say, oh, they're probably eating a sausage there. That shouldn't be our way of thinking. But nevertheless, us as the shoppers, as the consumers of that store, in other words, if we're going in, we have to bear in mind what others might suspect. Again, we're not defending the suspicion. You understand what I'm saying? The lookers who are, let's say we're looking and we're seeing other people, the spectators, whatever the right word would be, we're always supposed to judge everyone favorably. So that's not the point that I'm making. I'm saying the person who's actually doing it, who might not be judged favorably because of many people who sort of just see it and they rush to judgment, we have to bear that in mind as well. Okay, Sophie, you wanted to say the story?
Yeah, so the example that they gave in the book is that there was a funeral, and this rabbi, very important rabbi, left the funeral and went to a florist store. So his friend, the other important, I can't remember the names of the rabbis, after the funeral, and then he came back and he was carrying a flower pot, a ceramic flower pot. So that was like, how could you leave your friend's funeral? He was the best friend. So the rabbi who bought the flower pot said, every day I visit a man at the sanatorium who's got leprosy. And they told me that they were going to burn all his belongings. And I wanted to make sure that his tefillin would be buried. And they told me if I can show them a pot, an earthen pot, then I could have the tefillin and bury it properly. So the lesson in the story is you can't always know what someone's doing. That's why I
Right.
asked the question.
Yeah, so good. That's coming, and that's very good. Thank you for sharing that. That's coming from the perspective of the one who are seeing, that we're not supposed to judge. But the one who's actually doing, we have to be conscious of what other people might judge us for doing. Okay, so let's go inside. We're up to quote number 5, text 5 on page 4. And the first case, it goes like this, that, we're learning these week's parshas about the donation. So there's many times that people would give donations to the temple, and they had a storage for the donations, for the maintenance of the temple. So whenever one of the Kohanim would go in, I'm going to say this actually outside, one of the Kohanim would go in to take money in order to buy an animal, take money in order to fix something in the temple. Listen to this. Then he would have to go in with clothing that didn't have a hem, didn't have a cuff or a hem. and he's not allowed to go in with shoes, and not allowed to go in with sandals, not allowed to go in with tefillin, and not allowed to go in with the amulet, like a thing, a carrier, like a necklace or something. Why? Because people are going to suspect, oh, he went to go take money from the treasury of the temple, and he probably put a little bit in his pockets. So if he becomes rich, everyone's going to say, oh, no wonder he got rich. You know what he's doing, right? He's going to the treasury, taking some for himself. And if he becomes poor, what are people going to say? That's what happens to a ganav. Whatever is going to happen, he's always going to lose, because everyone's going to say that he obviously has a way of walking out with money without us noticing. So therefore, when the Kohen would go into the temple treasury to take money, he would have to go with clothing that had no pockets, and not only no pockets, no hem, no seam even, as we'll see in a moment, and no tefillin or anything like that. See, even tefillin could be seen as a way of smuggling something in. In fact, I mentioned earlier that in this week's parsha we speak about Moshe's service for 1 week prior to the 8th day, right? For the full week that Moshe was doing the service, I want to read a Gemara. The Gemara says like this: in which garments did Moshe perform the service in the tabernacle during the 7 days of dedication? Basically, Moshe was not a Kohen. So he's not allowed to wear the clothing of a Kohen. But he's doing the service, so what was he wearing? Wore regular clothing? So the Gemara answers like this. Rav Kana taught he did the service in a white frock, like in a white gown, without a hem or a seam. Moses did the service without a hem or a seam. Listen to this. The sleeves and body of the frock were all woven from one thread and were not made separately and then sewn together. Because when you have something and they're sewn together, then there's always a place to hide something. Thus, since the frock contained no stitching in which to hide coins, no one could suspect Moshe of pilfering from the Mishkan's treasury. In this way, Moshe fulfilled the verse, you should be clean from Hashem and from Israel. That implies that in the conduct of one's affairs, one should always be above suspicion. So, this is all the things all the text that we've seen till this point was all about money, fundraisers, those who are in charge of tzedakah, that they should always, and the following one, which I'm not going to read inside, is also that if someone collects money, let's say someone is in charge of a soup kitchen, or gets a lot of food and distributes the food, so obviously at one point if there's extra food, he should sell the food because it's going to go bad. Sell the food, and with the money, continue buying food in the future for those who need it. So if the person who's in charge has food, he should sell it. But he shouldn't sell it to himself. Because everyone's going to say, oh, you're taking charity stuff. You're taking things that people sponsored, people donated this for charity, and you're taking it for yourself. Right. So he should sell it to other people. You see what that means? Even if he would be getting the same price, he's not going to charge himself less. Nevertheless, you're not supposed to. Okay, so before I get to the story of Moshe Feinstein, which is a story that, a very practical case that he brings, which he was, like I said, he was attacked. He was, what would you say? Rebuked is the word he actually uses for behaving in a certain way. So I want to mention 2 other cases that the Gemara tells us. The Gemara tells us that amongst the Kohanim, amongst the priests, those who would do the service, there were 2 families that had special talent. They all were very talented, but 2 families had special talent. One family was especially talented in baking the bread. The show bread. Very special bread that was in the Beis HaMikdash, we mentioned in the past. No one else was able to do it as fresh as they did. No one else was able to do it as nice as they did. The rabbis tried to get them to lower the price and to charge less. They wouldn't. The rabbis tried to manipulate them by going somewhere else and getting another baker to teach how to do it. No one was able to do it that good. But the rabbis used to praise this family. They used to say, want to know something about this family? Never was fine bread to be found in their children's hands. So people shouldn't say they feed their children from the bread of the temple. In other words, this family were such good bakers, but none of their children ever ate regular bread. All the bread that they ate was not made of fine flour or fine bread, Why? They didn't want anyone to say, oh yeah, they bake it for the temple and then they take the leftovers. So you understand, they're famous, their whole fame comes from being good bakers. And their children never had good quality bread. So no one should say that they're taking the good quality bread that's supposed to be given to the temple, or the leftovers from that which was given to the temple. The same idea is also with the family of Kohanim that were experts in the spices, the incense offerings. Basically, there's a certain mixture of how to do it. And not everyone knew how to do it. In fact, no one knew how to do it besides this family. And this family, I think their name was Aftinas, yes. So the Aftinas family knew very well how to do it. And they, again, the rabbis also wanted them to lower the price. They didn't lower the price, so they had to stick with this family in doing it, because when they would make the spices, when it would burn, the smoke would go up straight like a pillar. When everyone else would make spices and they would burn this incense offering, the smoke would spread, like smoke does spread. So these guys were very skilled. But never did a bride in their house go forth perfumed. Never did any of their kalos, if their daughters got married, they never wore perfume. Why not? And not just add. And when they married a woman from elsewhere, they expressly forbade her from wearing perfume. So people should not say, these people take from the spices of the temple and use it for their own spices, for their own perfumes. Own fragrance, own smell, and own pleasure. Okay, these are cases that the Gemara uses to show how people were so careful of the Hiyisem Nikiyim, of being clean beyond reproach in the eyes of other people.
So, could you also say that they're preventing other people from speaking Lashon Hara?
Very interesting. So you're saying that perhaps one of the reasons, this would be, Sophie, you're making, I think, a very strong point, which is, in addition to the fact that we're trying to not, people shouldn't suspect me of doing something wrong. In addition to the fact that I don't want them to learn from me and to learn the wrong thing, I'm also trying to prevent them from speaking Lashon Hara. It's an interesting point, because really what we are worried about is not only what they're going to speak, but what they're going to think. So it's a step before Lashon Hara.
Well, yeah, but if that's the preventative measure.
Interesting. Okay.
I
mean, I would say it's another benefit, but it's not necessarily the direct agenda here. But to top it all off, I want to read this letter. And I translated here in English on the bottom of page 6. And the case was like this. You see, every Shabbos, so Shabbos comes in on sunset of Friday, right? Friday evening sunset. But candle lighting time is not exactly at sunset, it's 18 minutes earlier. So if you all have a Jewish calendar and it says what time, candle lighting time is this Friday, you know that 18 minutes after that time is sunset. For a woman who lights candles, she accepted Shabbos. So she's not allowed to do any work after she lights the candles. I'll give you a case. Let's say in my house, let's say my wife lights the Shabbos candle, and let's say I'm still home. So I forgot to put in the hot water. Or I forgot to shut off this light or turn on the bathroom light. I forgot. So, she'll mention that to me and I'll do it. Because she already accepted Shabbos, so she cannot do it. I still have 18 minutes. Because I didn't yet accept Shabbos. Accepting Shabbos for a woman is to light candles. Accepting Shabbos for a man is either if they say I'm accepting Shabbos, which could be in davening, or if the time comes. If the sun sets. The 18 minutes later, okay? So you got that? Moshe Feinstein was seen riding to shul, and many people do this, but he was seen going in a car after candle lighting time, going to shul. Many people do that. They're with their wives as they light the candles. They say good Shabbos, goodbye. They get into the car and they drive to shul. But someone wrote to Moshe Feinstein a letter. It actually says his name. I don't know who this guy is, but someone by the name of Moshe Metzger wrote a letter to Moshe Feinstein saying that, people are going to see, and women are going to see what you're doing. They're going to think that you're in a car on Shabbos. You see his...
Like it says, they didn't know the Jewish law.
Right. Exactly. So let's see what he writes. So he writes like this. He says, and just to be clear, he actually writes in his answer, he says, my drive to shul is maximum 2 minutes. In other words, we're not talking about a huge journey, before Shabbos, and he's taking a 15-minute drive, then you're cutting it really tight, the 18 minutes. But in this case, we're talking about a 2-minute drive. Moshe Feinstein from his house probably was picked up by someone who brought him to shul, which was 2 minutes drive, and he writes, L'chol hayoser, the maximum. He said, you asked if there's any issue with traveling in a car to shul after candlelighting for a short distance of a maximum of 2 minutes. He starts off like this, and this is a beautiful, listen to a Torah Jew. In other words, someone whose whole life is Torah, he's not offended. He doesn't feel attacked. In fact, listen to this. He says, I very much appreciate that you were careful to fulfill the mitzvah of rebuke, according to your opinion. In other words, what you found to be fit of rebuke. And I'm not upset about that, God forbid. So don't worry, you have no hard feelings of the fact that you're pointing out something that you're saying I'm doing something wrong. He says, and also, God willing, b'li neder means without any promise, because you don't want to make a vow, as we mentioned this in the past, but he said, God willing, I will not travel in a car after candlelighting time anymore. Even though there isn't even the slightest prohibition against it, not even that of arousing suspicion. There's absolutely no issue with what I was doing. Nevertheless, since you mentioned that some men and women will see it as degrading to the holiness of Shabbos, I will, b'li neder, see to it not to travel in a car past candlelighting time. You think this guy the person was making him crazy, right? But it just shows amazing how he says, and Moshe Feinstein knows halacha. You talk about halacha, the confidence of halacha. But someone is writing to him, he says, listen, I'm 100% sure there's nothing wrong with what I'm doing. I don't even have to worry about suspicion. But since you wrote that there'll be women who light candles and look out of their window and they see Moshe Feinstein in a car, or men who are going to see it and say, he's cutting it close to Shabbos, and it's like desecrating the holiness of Shabbos, I am not going in a car anymore at that time. Just to top it off, the strength of Moshe Feinstein, my teacher, I remember when we were bar mitzvah age 13, told us this story to show us, you want to know what kind of person Moshe Feinstein is in the world of halacha, because in halacha you need confidence of when he would say something, he was sure that what he was saying was right and what his ruling was correct because he knew the halacha, he knew the law. Listen to this story. He was once at a wedding. Maybe he was even the one doing, I think he was, the one doing, being misadik, officiating at the wedding. He's about to start officiating the wedding when the mother of the chassan, the mother of the boy, mother of the groom, comes to the rabbi and says, I have to tell you something very important. He says, what? Can you imagine? Everyone's waiting. And she comes to him and says, the boy is a mamzer. You know a mamzer?
Yeah.
In other words, he was born outside of the marriage. He was born, so he's not illegitimate child.
Oh, illegitimate child. Well, then he's not a mamzer, actually.
Why?
Well, if it was incest or...
No, I'm saying
then it
incest.
would be.
I'm saying incest. It's not considered illegitimate?
No, I'll say...
In illegitimate relationship, regardless. No, that's the point. Okay, I might be getting the terms wrong, but the fact is, he said this boy's a mamzer. I'm the mother.
But he's Jewish, he's just.
Yeah, but the problem is, a mamzer getting married will be a big issue with
That's a huge issue.
So what would a rabbi typically do? Probably say, okay, I need a few hours, come back, whatever, or try to verify, ask her more questions or anything. She says it.
She took that time to do it.
He took that time. Maybe she was vindictive against him or something like that. Who knows? He closes his eyes for a second, and he remembers that it says that if a woman says something like that, he remembers what the halacha is. What's the halacha? Eino ne'emenes. She's not believed. He says, he yells out loud in front of everyone, Eino ne'emenes, takes the cup of wine and starts the blessings and officiates the wedding. He was so confident. He had no doubts. So the mother is coming and saying that the boy is a mamzer. The rabbi listens and says, she is not trusted. That means we disregard her absolutely 100%. She has no proof. Who knows? Maybe she has a reason of being vindictive, trying to ruin this wedding. She doesn't like the girl or whatever it is. We don't believe her whatsoever. He's a boy like any other yeshiva boy.
Why would he announce it though? That's embarrassing.
No, he announced the fact that no one should hear her words and think that there's any legitimacy to it. In halacha, there's no standing. Probably she was making
How would he know?
No, he doesn't. He knows the halacha. He knows the law. The law is that she is disregarded 100%. That's my point I'm saying.
The timing? Don't you
No.
know what
If a mother does that and just says it without any witnesses, without any backing, without any, then it's worthless. It's like, it's the epitome of fake news.
How come Moshe was not a Kohen, but his brother was?
We'll get to that, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. No, but it's a good point, and I'm sure we'll address that.
I want to tell you something. In my other Gemara class, we were learning that after the Korban Beit HaMikdash, the people were so hungry, they were starving. They killed their children and ate them. Is that true?
It does say that in Eicha.
It says it in Eicha, right?
Okay, so that's the, yeah.
The gentleman you're talking about who was the expert in the 80s, who's the expert now?
There are a lot of halachic authorities. When I say expert, I'm talking about specifically in the area, in the realm of halacha.
Right. Is there anybody
Yeah,
today?
I'm sure. I mean, I don't know if anyone could say, I don't know if anyone could take the place of Moshe Feinstein. Exactly. There are specialists. There are people that are still specialists in certain fields. Like if you have a question in, let's say, marriage issues, I'm sure there are certain people that are experts in that. Fertility issues is a big deal nowadays because a lot of new questions are coming up with advancement in modern technology. So some of them are in Israel, some of them are in America, some of them are maybe even in Europe, but it's hard for me to say now one single answer for that, but so you have things like in the Chabad world that for certain questions there are certain people that are experts in that field, that those are the people we deal with.
He knew everything.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Who's that?
Moshe Feinstein really covered all areas of halacha. Okay.
Well, he was kind of one of a kind.
You're right. I want to move on now to if you realize our handout is done. But we always share a story at this time. The following story is quite an incredible story. And it's really continuing in the theme of the story of last week, which is that in these week's parshas we're learning about the fact that every individual had their talent that was used in the building of the Mishkan. In other words, we all have a talent. We all have a quality that we could bring to the table that nobody else could. Now, and we all serve Hashem differently. We all do our role differently. The Baal Shem Tov, this is the way the story goes. So please, a lot of them, parts of the story could be like, as I said, incredible, but I'm going to say it as it's written. That the Baal Shem Tov was once shown that there is someone who, it said, like the Baal Shem Tov will be lucky if he gets to be with that person in heaven. In other words, there's someone who's greater than him out there. Now, the Baal Shem Tov was the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was the greatest of his generation. Who could it be? So he wants to meet the person who's greater than him. So and not out of arrogance, he wants to meet the person. And what's this person's special way of serving Hashem? You see, the Baal Shem Tov was teaching everyone, igniting the neshama, the soul of every individual. And here there's someone who's greater than he is. So what the Baal Shem Tov does is he takes his students and they start traveling. And they travel until they reach a certain place, mountains and hills, a field with grass. And they see sheep, many sheep. And they see a shepherd taking care of the sheep. The shepherd pulls out a horn, blows the horn, and the sheep gather together, and the shepherd gives them all water to drink. And the shepherd doesn't notice that the Baal Shem Tov and his students are not too far away, and the shepherd starts speaking very loudly. And he looks up to heaven, he says, God, you're amazing. You're amazing. Look what you created. Beautiful, beautiful world. You gave me my life. You're so kind to me. You're so kind to everyone. What could I do? I don't know how to learn. My parents never taught me how to learn. I never was, they didn't have money to afford Jewish education. I don't know how to daven. I don't know how to read the words in the siddur. So what am I supposed to do? I want to praise you. But one thing I do know how to do, I have a horn that the sheep listen to. I'll blow my horn. And he's blowing until he's out of breath and falls. He can't stand from so much, exertion. After a few minutes, he catches his breath, he gets up again, and again he starts talking to God. And he says, God, you're so kind, you're so amazing, but I don't know how to daven, I don't know how to learn, I don't know how to praise you properly. But I know how to sing. So I know how to sing songs that I sing for the sheep, for the cattle. And he starts singing and singing and singing and singing until he's so much out of breath, he falls down. After he finishes that, he catches his breath again, gets up again on his feet, and this is where the miraculous part of the story begins. The man says, yesterday, the nobleman who we all watch as sheep, all our shepherds, we do different things for him. He gathered us together, and he gave us each a raise. He gave us each a coin, silver coin for every one of us. God, this is what I have, but I love you so much, I want to give it to you as a gift. Take it. He takes the coin, and he throws it up to heaven. The miraculous part is that it didn't fall down. And the Baal Shem Tov turned to his students and said, you see, we all have our way of building a Mishkan. We all have our talents that we have to use. For one person, it's going to be learning. It's going to be studying. For another person who is not as capable, it's going to be singing to Hashem. For one person, it's going to be davening. Another person who's not able or not as comfortable with the words of davening, it's going to be blowing a horn. But it's going to be loving Hashem with all your might. And in the building of the Mishkan in these weeks that we're concluding this week's parsha, I think emphasize that very much. That every single Jew had their role to play. And they weren't identical one to another. And I think that's very true in every gathering. In a room like this, we all have our way of connecting to Hashem. We all have our contribution to God's home, to the Mishkan. I want to conclude with one last thing, a teaching of Chassidus that relates to the end of this week's parsha, a beautiful thing. At the end of the parsha, the very, very end, as I said, it talks about when the clouds would leave, they would know to travel. And that's the end of the book of Shemais, the book of Exodus. Chassidus says like this week's parsha is called Pekudei, which means a reckoning. It means an accounting. Every one of us has to make an accounting. We have to make an accounting, right? Not every moment, but at the end of, obviously, a year, a person on their birthday, we make an accounting of the mitzvahs we do. How could we be better? Where did we reach from last year to this year? Like any person in their business has to make such an accounting. We have to make an accounting with our quote-unquote Jewish business or godly business, which is, some people have this, tomorrow is the day before Rosh Chodesh, because we're starting a new Jewish month, the month of Adar. The second month of Adar begins tomorrow night. So many people use the last day of the month as a day of reckoning, a day of thinking about the past month. What did I accomplish this month in terms of serving Hashem, davening, mitzvahs, and so on? But the end of this week's parsha tells us what should be the bottom line. The bottom line should be continue traveling. As the end of this week's parsha, the end of the parsha, all about reckoning, making an audit, tells us, but when the cloud goes up, it's time to move, meaning the bottom line of our accounting should not be, okay, wow, amazing. Tap ourselves on the shoulder and say, this is what I did, I've accomplished so much, it was a great month. It was a good month. But the bottom line must be, we're continuing to travel, and we're traveling meaning increasing, and we're not going to be satisfied on where we are today. A Jewish accounting, the bottom line is to add. The bottom line is to add onto what we've done up until this point. So let me summarize what we learned today. Parsha itself, parsha of the audit, which concludes with how the Jews would travel when the cloud would raise, and it's a Shabbos Chazak. After the parsha is done, we announce Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek. The second segment, which took the majority of the time, we learned about the halacha of maris ayin, of being conscious of suspicion of what other people would say when they see what we do. And we spoke about that from different angles. And we brought a classical case from Moshe Feinstein with driving on Shabbos, and not on Shabbos, driving after Shabbos candle lighting. The third segment, we shared a story of the Baal Shem Tov, which highlights once again that we all have our contribution to make in building this home for Hashem, this Mishkan. The fourth segment, we hopefully now understand how this whole parsha, the theme of the parsha is, we have to once in a while make an accounting of our stand in Torah and mitzvahs and Judaism, Yiddishkeit, but the bottom line always must be, where are we going from now? Where are we traveling? How are we going to make sure that tomorrow should be better than today? Thank you very much, everyone, for coming together to learn, and we should all have a good week, and I look forward to seeing everyone again next week. Mitzvah Shem.